Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Proimos, Head of Institutional Content and Investment Magazine, and this is Market Narratives. This show is a series of unorthodox conversations with thought leaders influencing the world of fiduciary investors. For more related insights and analysis, please remember to check out our website, investmentmagazine.com.au, and subscribe for a free email. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. My guest today is Lurion De Mello, who's a senior lecturer in applied finance and energy markets, and also the co-chair of the Australasian Commodity Markets Conference held by Macquarie University. Welcome, Lurion.
Hi, Alex. How are you?
Very well. So this is going to be a conversation about renewables and alternate energy. I thought the place to start this conversation was really some of the ideologies and factions that sit within this space. There really seems to be different camps, and I was hoping that you could maybe kick us off with how to sort of think about it.
Yeah, I guess the climate guys have been fighting off the coal industry for many years, and that has kind of escalated even more as we've set targets to meet certain emission reductions. And unfortunately, that's where it lies. It's more like to do with the coal industry versus renewables. But it's a bigger picture than that. We need to kind of look at all the energy options. Electricity generation is a key factor. We want cheap energy prices, but unfortunately, with one camp going against the other one, using sometimes very extremist kind of views, scare tactics. So this comes from the climate guys as well. Sometimes some of their modeling is not really backed up with proper hypothesis and development. So we need to kind of bring a balance in terms of how Australia is going to address its energy future.
Is there a lot of pressure from different scientific groups, with a lot of government funding to sort of push one way or the other?
Yeah, I guess we need to respect the scientific findings, and we need to respect the climate scientists, who have warned us about temperatures rising. I mean, no doubt about that. But how do we address that? This is where the problem is. The fossil fuel industry has a lot of subsidies behind it. The renewable energy would require even large amounts of money and support from government in terms of funding to come up with more efficient ways of delivering renewable energy. We are getting there slowly, but we are not there yet. I mean, people need to understand that why coal is still very important. And some people say coal is king and will be king for probably another 20, 30 years is because, the energy intensity that you get from coal cannot really be matched by some of the other options. How do you measure energy intensity? We can look at, energy density. We can look at energy return over energy investment. How do you measure the efficiency of a particular type of energy? So, the scientific community and the economists and the, climate guys, your petroleum engineers, your guys who are doing scientific research on improving battery storage, all these guys need to communicate together. And, rather than each side putting their own foot in, claiming that their energy source is the best.
So how should we then think about sort of, you talk about coal being king. Is there particular approaches? Obviously, for things like steel production, you need a huge amount of energy. Renewables don't seem to be the way to actually generate the heat to actually make steel. Is there still going to be then different places as we look at the market in terms of different energy sources for different applications?
Yeah. Coal. I mean, coal and steel production is very interesting because, I remember the time when I did a 3-month stint at BHP back in Perth during the uni days. I worked on the project. They had this hot briquetted iron project in up the northern part of Western Australia, and over there, the BHP was producing the steel briquettes. Now, to produce steel, from my understanding, is that if you don't want the iron ore to go into liquid formation, if you want to go directly from iron ore to steel, you need to use this thing called direct reduced iron. So the way it does, you use coke from coal, and you use that and mix it with your iron ore to produce steel. So to replace that, the only other option would be to use, say, hydrogen. So hydrogen direct reduced iron. Now, hydrogen is very, very expensive to produce. It is, people don't realize that you need large amounts of hydrogen to get the same amount of intensity in terms of output. So, for example, if you use 100 units of hydrogen and you're going to use that in some sort of a combustion or some sort of a process, by the time you lose the heat and you lose the energy, you might only use 20%, or 20 units of that hydrogen. So coal will play an important role. With the recent move towards, having manufacturing done over here, what are we going to manufacture? I mean, if you start manufacturing steel, instead of just digging out iron ore and exporting it, we would need coal. There's no other substitute to produce steel than coal.
It's an interesting piece because, particularly now when we've got a bit of an economic crisis on our hands due to coronavirus and there's this constant push for infrastructure, a lot of this infrastructure is going to need steel and very energy intense sources. So I guess now the challenge is how do we then potentially reduce our energy emissions at the same time try to maintain this infrastructure binge and also the real estate binge. There's a lot of apartments that are being built and commercial towers that are being built, but a lot of the imports here again need huge amounts of energy to get them going.
That's correct, and pretty much on the back of the government's announcements of giving $25,000 away for home renovations and so forth. I mean, definitely, steel demand is going to increase. I mean, we can see Australia's iron ore exports to China have started to increase, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps the Aussie dollar has recovered. So it's it's a huge market, and not just China, but globally, we would need a lot of steel if you want to have you're going to get construction going to support a recovery.
Mm-hmm. So, you talked about some of the subsidies that the governments are providing. I know the renewable players in the market are always screaming and saying that coal's being given subsidies. And you mentioned that some of the renewable people are also getting subsidies. Can you give a bit more clarity on sort of that backdrop?
Yeah, we need to develop our renewables. I think it is important that we do come up more with more efficient ways of utilizing our sun, for example. So solar is very important, and how that solar energy is harnessed and stored and then fed into the grid. I mean, this is all would need. Any industry needs subsidies, in the beginning. So we hope that the subsidies are going in the right areas, to develop the technology, to develop battery storage capability, and this is something where, for example, people who criticize solar, they straight away start attacking about the storage and the battery problem. That goes with electric cars or solar powered solutions, where pretty much you need to you need to improve the battery storage problem. But at the same time, we need to realize that that's not the right argument. If a battery in a car, for example, I think on average it's around 500,000 kilometers you can get out of the battery. You need to move away and perhaps find ways of using the battery to store the electricity perhaps at home. So extending the life cycle of a product is important.
The whole piece about batteries has also been really interesting because there seems to be a lot of energy that goes into making these batteries, a lot of minerals that goes into it. As we think about the whole energy cycle, to create this energy, we need other energy. How do we look at that whole footprint? These batteries need to be reconditioned, but they obviously don't last forever. Is there some other unintended costs that come alongside some of these new forms of energy?
Yeah, I mean, with the batteries, with all renewables, you need minerals, and the amount of minerals. If you are going to move towards a huge proportion or a huge energy mix towards renewables, you would require some really rare earth minerals or some common minerals. So mining activity would have to increase by a huge amount to actually support the renewable industry. And this is again, so what do? We have the mining guys or people who are against mining will start protesting that say, stop the mining, or they'll try and block it. So we cannot move away from fossil fuels. We cannot move away from mining. So it is important that we have a right mix. That's why, not just sticking to one side of the equation is not a good idea. We need to kind of get the solar guys, the wind guys, gas, LNG, all these infrastructure issues have to be solved by getting all the players together and coming up with a proper energy roadmap for Australia.
You talked about natural gas there. That's been seen as one of the ways to transition towards renewable energy. What's your feeling on natural gas as a viable solution and also a cost-effective solution?
Yeah, I guess, we could spend like 30 minutes just talking about gas. The essence of gas in Australia is that the local domestic gas is so expensive compared to gas that you can purchase overseas. Now, we're talking about LNG here. So you can buy LNG cheaper in Asia than you can over here. And within Australia, we have a different LNG price for the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, the government has proposed, to build a pipeline from the west to the east because gas is cheaper in the west. To me and to a few other energy economists, this doesn't make sense because I think it's around $6 billion it's going to cost, to dig up the earth, to install pipelines. Australia is a big country, right? We are not like the US or some sort of a European country, a small country where you could perhaps have a network of gas. Germany, for example, might have pipeline of gas coming from Russia and some other countries, but Australia is too wide. You can imagine the cost is going to, this is a 6 billion figure. It's probably going to end up being 10 billion. So having piped gas in Australia is probably not a good idea, but dismissing gas completely is also not a good idea. Let me say this. Diesel, for example, right? Diesel produces a lot of emissions, nitrogen oxide, but nobody talks about phasing away from diesel. Now, could LNG be the fuel to replace diesel? Volvo, for example, is already manufacturing LNG trucks. Now, companies would not put so much money into R&D to come up with these vehicles if they didn't feel that eventually there would be pressure for diesel to be wiped off.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that you talked about diesel for trucks. I guess the other big transport issue is aircraft, jet fuel. How can jet fuel change? I know there's been talks about hydrogen. Is there any real opportunity there for a change in the next sort of 20 years?
Definitely not. I think jet fuel will be here forever. And I guess this is why, we cannot just stop oil or refining oil. Jet fuel, I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but I would say at least for another 60, 70, maybe even 100 years, jet fuel would be in use. Jet fuel is a very complex process. To my knowledge, I think it's manufactured by actually combining three types of kerosene. So there you have a jet A1 fuel, which they use for like long-haul international flights. And then you have a slightly lower version of the jet fuel, which is used for short-haul flights. So, replacing, hydrogen is so far away. We did, for example, hydrogen buses were trialed in Perth in 2007, and I actually remember riding on them. And after that, there was no mention about hydrogen at all. So I think public transport systems, trains, for example, they've already had a very successful trial of a hydrogen-powered train in Germany. They're also trialing hydrogen-powered trains in the UK. So there is a lot of R&D still going on with the use of hydrogen. But how do you switch? Hydrogen, gives you zero emissions. Well, not technically all zero, but that's beyond this conversation. But hydrogen looks like a likely replacement sometime in the future. But right now, I think hydrogen for aircrafts is a long, long away.
Look, you talk about sort of the buses and trains and running hydrogen there. Look, how do you then get to economies of scale to be able to deliver these? Australia is a big country and some long distances that need to be covered. Is there the energy that's available to power these types of transport?
Yeah, so I guess I mean in California, for example, they've had hydrogen buses running for some time, but they've also had problems in infrastructure. So hydrogen is not only very expensive to produce. Right now, around 90 to 95% of hydrogen is what we call brown hydrogen. So that is produced from natural gas. I mean, eventually we want to get to green hydrogen, but how do we get that? I mean, there are different ways of, using chemicals and I mean, the CSIRO does some great work in this area in terms of, how we're going to get to green hydrogen. But brown hydrogen has to be, the intermediate sort of solution if you want to go down the hydrogen economy path. So Australia is a big country, but, in terms of refueling for cars, I think hydrogen for cars is again a long time away. But hydrogen for buses, yeah, you could have each state having refueling stations, for hydrogen. Solar and electric vehicles. I mean, the charge time for electric vehicles is much longer, but we need to give people the option. We need to open the markets up for electric vehicles as well. And this is where the problem comes with, I guess people think electric vehicles, Tesla, right? Now Tesla, I mean, costs, I don't know, 60, 70 grand, and up for a Tesla car. So it's still now it's for the wealthy. But there are Toyota and Nissan and all these other guys are producing smaller vehicles, electric vehicles. But unfortunately, we don't see many of them over here as we do in, say, Europe.
I think your numbers on Tesla are pretty generous. I think maybe 60 US are over 100 as last I've seen in the Australian market. So they're still very expensive. The piece I wanted to touch on there, and you talked about infrastructure, but how do you think about the infrastructure to deliver? Like if it's hydrogen, for example, how do you then fuel this out? Even electric power, if you need charging of your car, you're driving down the east coast of Australia, for example. The infrastructure that needs to be built to be able to deliver that power to all these EV vehicles, is that really been thought out properly?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is the thing. I think the government's kind of jumped onto this hydrogen bandwagon and perhaps gone a few steps ahead. I mean, there's no clear guidance. You're right on the infrastructure side of things, except for building a pipeline, to transport gas. So we don't want to make the mistakes of what California did with its hydrogen infrastructure. So perhaps we need to consult them, or we need to consult people who are experts in hydrogen as to how we're going to build this infrastructure. But for the common person who drives their car, I mean that's not going to happen for a long time. So I think the infrastructure has to be built by, say, utility companies. Origin, for example, I think has already developed quite a bit of, put a lot of resources in terms of developing the hydrogen. So utility companies have to take the lead, and then I guess public transportation, has to be introduced. I mean, the fact is, Alex, car companies, truck companies, people building trains are actually building, vehicles that will run on hydrogen. So it's not that you build the infrastructure and then say, hey, guys, stop producing the internal combustion engine, now switch over to hydrogen vehicles. That's probably not going to happen. As you said, hydrogen is expensive. There is a lot of work to be done in terms of the R&D, to find economies of scale with hydrogen. And we want green hydrogen ultimately. So you don't want, again, to deal with, for the next 50 or 60 years, just dealing with, hydrogen that's produced, 90% produced from fossil fuels. We want to bring that fossil fuel contribution to hydrogen generation a bit down.
Mm-hmm. Let's stay on the fuel piece. And one of the areas that we've tried to be convinced by some of the motoring companies is that ethanol is a great addition to fuels. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the inclusion of ethanol, and does it really actually help emissions?
Yeah. Going to fuels. I mean, in Australia, we have the E10. Now, the E10 was first blended with a 91 RON fuel. Yeah. So your common unleaded fuel. Now you can see ethanol being blended with 94. But the problem with fuel in Australia is, again, we are so, kind of obsessed with this whole coal industry emissions that transportation fuels is something that's been neglected. Now the 91 fuel, it's highly, it produces the highest sulfur out of all the fuels. So, but there are no incentives from the government. I mean, the excise tax and GST, or the excise tax is pretty much the same across any fuel type. Now, that doesn't make sense. You should be encouraging motorists to move away from 91, or you have to kind of find some sort of a roadmap to completely eliminate 91 out of the market. Now, if you go to Europe, Germany in particular, their ethanol fuel is blended with 95, and in some petrol stations also with 98. So they have gotten rid of their 91 RON fuel for a very long time. So that's why we are not taking the immediate steps of addressing, the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxide, all these issues. We are kind of always focused on CO2 emissions. So we need to make sure that our 91 fuel, although it's ethanol, which is good. The same thing with biodiesel. There was a big push towards biodiesel, but then at the end of the day, diesel is highly polluting. So is gasoline, but we need the gasoline. And ethanol is produced from different agricultural grains. So there's this issue with food and clearing of land to plant these crops to make the ethanol. So there are, I guess, different sides on how you see it. But the main thing is we need to get rid of that 91 fuel.
So you're suggesting that there's just one particular 95 fuel that's there with ethanol as a blend, rather than these options of 91, 95, 98. I think there's a whole range of things floating around at the moment.
Yeah, again, it's like not jumping ship. At the end of the day, it's about affordability, right? And that's one of the things that we need to look at. We don't want the price of fuel to suddenly increase, but we want to reduce fuels, or to improve the quality of fuels that can produce the least amount of emissions. Now that also goes hand in hand with emission standard cars. Now we have these Euro 5, Euro 6 emissions. Now the Australian government has pushed back Euro 6, emission standards, I think to 2023. And this is something, we need to take steps in addressing these issues rather than just jumping straight down, say, the hydrogen path. And it's only if you take care of the immediate, fuel issues, that's where you're making a start, or you're building onto a roadmap towards, reducing your emissions.
Can you give a bit more clarity on what that Euro, I think you said Euro 6 standard is?
Yeah, so again, I'm not a mechanical engineer or a petroleum engineer, but I think from my understanding it's to do with the engine technology, and it's also to do with how the fuel burns with the engine. So it's not a target or anything as such, but it's more to do with the engine technology, and that gives you the least amount of emissions as possible. Now, these are, right now, the Euro 6 standard diesel vehicle, I think, produces around the same amount of emissions as a petrol or a gasoline-driven vehicle. So, but we are still back onto that Euro 5. Mm-hmm. So we need to address these issues first. We also have hybrid cars. We just started on this concept of hybrid vehicles to reduce our emissions. But then do we see a whole flood of Toyota Camry hybrids or a Prius? There isn't. People are still hanging on to conventional fuel type vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch the conversation a little bit to the superannuation industry. Mm-hmm. A number of them have been under pressure from their members actually to move towards more ESG, environmentally sustainable investments, and there's been a lot of work that's been done in terms of trying to move away from some of the coal assets and towards renewables. Sort of curious to get your thoughts in terms of the investability of some of these areas for pension funds.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, at the end of the day, some of these projects could be high risk, and it all depends on what the members want. I mean, you have to be careful that, you cannot take a huge amount of risk with any unproven technology or unproven sort of path that is kind of like, I mean, ESG investing is huge. I mean, I think before the crash, I think some of the super funds are returning 20%, 15% returns compared to like say a normal balanced fund, or a domestic fund or an international fund focused mostly on equities. So I think ESG investing in that is important for super funds. But I think super funds also need to invest in their own industry. Now, for me, working at the university, we have UniSuper. So perhaps UniSuper, should be investing more on university projects, sustainability projects. These are important. Oil companies, for example, are being held to account. I think there's some litigation cases going on in the US right now against BP, where everyone, shareholders are demanding, what is your emissions target, or what role are you playing in terms of having more action towards climate change? Where are your priorities? What are you investing in terms of renewables? So shareholders are demanding this kind of information. So eventually, I guess, members of super funds need to, I guess, have a balance in terms of getting a good return for their retirement. And super funds have to be wary that they don't go and invest in projects that are, might sound nice or feel good because they are ESG type investments. But if there's a huge risk involved in terms of the technology behind some of these investments and the thinking behind these investments, then you might have super funds losing a lot of money.
Do the economics stack up in a lot of the renewables, in terms of its ability to generate power at a reasonable price and be able to sell, obviously, to some other source?
Yeah, I guess renewables on their own are not sufficient. I mean, if you have load problems and stuff with electricity, you need to perhaps have a gas-fired generator kicking in. So renewables on their own cannot provide all the electricity needs of Australia. So we need to have a mix, and that's why fossil fuels will be important for a long time. We might have solar, and we might have these feed-in tariffs and people connecting their solar into the grid. That might work, in a small-scale operation. But if there's a power surge or anything like that, or at nighttime, or you have suddenly like a dust storm, for example, right, that blocks the sun out. I mean, you might have some issues, with a sudden overhang of clouds for days, or then you might have an issue with solar. So you need to have a backup. It's like having a backup generator, like in a hospital, right? You have a backup generators. In an operating theater, you need to have backup energy. So the same thing applies to, if you want to have continuous and reliable energy, we need to have fossil fuels backing up the renewables.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many people who are listening to this getting outraged about the need for fossil fuels and hoping that we continue to move towards this renewable future. But this is why we have the conversation, just to give people a bit more of a backdrop. The area that you haven't touched on yet, and I'm not sure how much work you've done, is in the nuclear space, or different forms of nuclear that I've seen popping up. Have you looked at that area?
No, I mean, I'm not a specialist. I've not looked into that to comment on that. But I guess, just going by what's happened in Japan and what's happened in Germany, the move away from nuclear. I know France still has some dependency on nuclear, and the proponents of nuclear in Australia say, hey, we have so much land, so much landfill opportunity to dump nuclear waste that we should be looking for a nuclear option. So, there are. As I said, at the end of the day, it's a matter of getting the scientific community and the experts in these fields to get together. But personally, I don't think nuclear is an option for Australia.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other new types of fuel cell or fusion energy that's out there that does have some promise that you've come across?
Yeah, there are certain. I mean, even with hydrogen, even producing it from rust. I mean, there was a recent paper by some Japanese professors who come up with ways of generating hydrogen from rust. So these are all like initial stages. I mean, the important thing is economies of scale, right? I mean, till you have economies of scale, you won't be able to sell that, or the costs of having that is going to be huge. And then if you're talking about electricity, I mean, we're always fighting to keep our bills down, our electricity costs down. So without fossil fuels or bringing in these technologies, which are like a few years away, is just going to increase the cost. So, I mean, fuel cell is for cars and stuff. Yes, there's a lot of space in that. There's even like cars where the energy is being generated in the wheel. So the turning of the wheel actually charges up the battery, so you don't have to go and charge it at a charge point. The wheel itself will continuously charge the battery as you drive. So there are all these technologies and institutions that are researching various alternatives for electric vehicles, but that's still a way. I think your normal battery operated vehicle is probably your nearest bet in terms of moving towards an electric vehicle.
Mm-hmm. So last question around sort of how to sort of get more renewables back into the system. I'm curious on your thoughts around sort of whether there's various levies that need to be placed on some of the fossil fuels, or some other incentive credits that needs to come in. Curious on sort of how to balance that out to maybe fast track some parts of development of renewables.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not an expert to comment on this, but I would say it would have to be a combination of government subsidies. I mean, people always say, yeah, get rid of fossil fuels, but if the government imposes some sort of an environmental emissions levy or tax onto their onto their income or onto their annual tax filing, then are people going to be happy with that? I mean, everybody wants to go green, but when it comes to actually paying for this green energy, people are going to be willing to put some sort of a levy, or to contribute to this roadmap to green energy. So but it would have to be subsidized. But I don't know exactly what the government's intentions are at the moment. I mean, we just hear about subsidies, but we don't really hear about any more detailed as to how these subsidies would be used to support renewables.
Yeah, it's an incredible place when everyone has a particular ideology or a dream that they have, and then ultimately they need to pay for it. And there's a lot of questions about how much are people willing to pay, and then there's the whole push for maintaining the economy on its current trajectory. So cost is always a big part of it. But that's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for your time today, Lurion.
Thank you, Alex. Have a good day.
Thank you for joining us. All views expressed on this podcast are subject to change and do not necessarily reflect the views of Conexus Financial. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment advice.